Welcome to the Spirit Underground podcast with Dharma teachers Spring Washam and Lama Rod Owens. These conversations will include topics on Black liberation theology, healing with plant-based medicine, indigenous wisdom, Buddhist-based meditation practices, and reconnecting to our ancestral knowledge. Together we will explore what freedom means individually, collectively, and spiritually. If you would like to support the Spirit Underground podcast, please visit the BeHereNowNetwork.com/donate. Okay, hi everybody. We're back with Spirit Underground, our podcast. I'm Spring Washam.
I am Lama Rod.
We're here in Atlanta, Georgia, everybody.
All of 1,000 feet from each other.
I know. And this episode, wow, there's a lot going on. And we wanted to talk about politics and spirituality. It's messy business here.
Yeah.
And just share some thoughts about this as we navigate this road with our elders and our lineages, and we're just holding the complexity of everything that's going on. And Rod, we were talking offline about the history of our lineages a little bit, and what I was reflecting a lot on is our neighborhood is we're historic in a way. We're not far from Dr. King's home. We're not far from Ebenezer Baptist Church. We are here in a very active, socially engaged community that seems like it's on the front line of a lot of things. And what do you think the role is now in our lives? When we that's one of our lineages, and we can talk about our Buddhist tradition too, and the activism that has gone on with Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh. And what are your thoughts about spiritual leaders today and the role of the political movement, which feels hard to separate ourselves from the collective? Yeah, and it's holding collective liberation. So I love these conversations. So let's get into it in this episode.
Well, when I think about Dharma, Buddhism, I had this really strange experience early on because I never thought of politics and Dharma being separate, or justice or liberation struggle being separate from the practice of Buddhism, and Buddha Dharma particularly. So I have never had that kind of split in my practice, right? When I think about politics, I think about, okay, these are the choices that we make to live together. These are the choices that we're making to create social, cultural boundaries to protect one another and to make sure people have what they need. Right. And in that sense, politics becomes this very intense struggle, because there are real inequities, that I think social justice movement is trying to disrupt and trying to bring more equity into. Right. I think that gets a little complicated and messy, when we start kind of opening up to spirituality, to religion in particular, because all of a sudden we have these practices, these belief systems that inform us that there are people maybe who deserve more than others, or that, there are people who haven't gone through the rituals, the empowerments, the certifications, whatever, that makes one eligible to receive the resources from a divine source and so forth, right? That's when it starts getting tricky. But when I came into Buddhism, Buddhism was like, oh yeah, we all deserve to be free. Right? We already are free. We're already awakened Buddhists who have forgotten our awakened minds, right? Our basic good, basic goodness, right? And so I was like, oh, great. That sounds great. Like, no one deserves freedom more than anyone else. We all deserve to be free. Right. And therefore, I will align my whole life around that particular aspiration. And then the expression of that aspiration through action and practice and study and so forth. Right. Um, so when I think about lineages of spiritual leaders, I think it's been so important that we've had these great change makers, also, who are also functioning as spiritual leaders come through and say, you know what, in order to be in a relationship to the divine, we also have to be in a relationship to one another, that we can't bypass relationships, that we're forming with one another, relationships where we're requiring certain resources to be well and happy and safe. Like, we have to be concerned with that, right, in order to open to this larger, more expansive experience of the divine or the sacred, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um, that loving your neighbor, right, is an expression of God, right? But the issue, of course, is what is love, right?
Right.
And I think that's the front line for all of us. We talk about love, but what is love?
Mm.
Right. And how does a love ethic, or really, actually, how can a love ethic be at the root
Right.
of how we relate to one another and how we believe that we all deserve the resources to be well, safe, happy, and so forth?
And I think what's hard right now is people seem to be making it like they have a choice to engage or not engage. Whereas for
Mm,
us, it's like,
mhm.
we're so dedicated to collective liberation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's the hard point in the spiritual communities, right? Is that some people choose not to talk about anything
Hmm.
outside of what's happening in their little dojo or meditation
Hmm.
center or church. Um,
Yeah.
there's that side, right? And
Yeah.
then there's the group that really merges it, but in a way that the collective liberation is violent, like
Yeah.
white nationalism,
Yeah.
and where they're using a lot of people and Christians. And we see this in Muslim communities. We see everyone who takes that and moves it
Mm-hmm.
into this violence.
Hmm.
And
Well,
that's really hard.
yeah, no, absolutely. Right. And a lot of what you speak to is really what we would call spiritual bypassing, like in a dharmic framework. I think that when you're choosing not to show up, to be aware of something, to notice something, to hold space for something, then you're actually bypassing. Right. And we can't get to the liberation that we need to get to if we're always saying, well, this is like worldly, this is secular, like I'm not going to deal with this,
Right.
and I'm going to define what sacred and divine is, and that's what I'm going to concern myself with. But again, when I came into dharma, basic Buddhism, the core philosophy of Buddhism, particularly as expressed in Tantra, is that everything is sacred, because everything is an expression of emptiness, and emptiness itself is divine, is sacred, right? And so everything, therefore, is asking us to show up to it, to
Mhm.
to respond to it, to tend to it, right? Including how we're living collectively together, as well. But we also have to take into account, like, liberation struggle and the complexity of liberation struggle, because liberation struggle is not just about, cultivating awareness, right, and compassion as we do in Buddhism, but it's also making choices to to get access to the resources that we need on the ground, right? And sometimes you have to fight for that. As we've seen, from the communities that we come from, right? It's like
Right.
sometimes you have to push back, right? You have to organize, right? And that's a place that I have been so acquainted with as an activist. Early on in my teens, I was like, oh, I have to like fight back. Like I have to do something. Like I just can't sit around and wait for equality or the end of like racism and homophobia and all of that. Like I have to like get out and do something, right? And sometimes that doing early on for me wasn't really based in love. It was based from deep hurt, and how that deep hurt expressed itself as anger, and how I used anger,
Right.
to be in the world struggling and resisting, right? And that's
And to be
when
heard
to
too,
be
right?
heard.
We wanna be heard.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And anger is so incredibly important in our struggle, right? But as I moved, through my 20s and really started coming into my own dharma practice, which began with meditation, like I began to see, oh, anger is absolutely important, but actually love is what drives us, is what guides us to real freedom, to real liberation, to real healing. And anger is
Mhm.
informing that that struggle, that work, right? But what I am seeing more, and as I've always seen, right, since I started getting into this work, is that like people are really trapped in the anger as their source of energy and inspiration for liberation struggle,
Yeah,
right?
it's almost
And
like if you're not, you're attacked for not being angry
yeah,
enough or
yeah,
caring enough.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely, right. And then we have these great spiritual leaders, introduce Dr. King. I would also say Malcolm X, and many more, right? I'm not limiting, on purpose, but when I think about these spiritual leaders, I also want to just name Fannie Lou Hamer as
Yes.
well as a political
Oh
organizer
my
and
gosh, yes.
activist. Like she was about the politics as well,
Ye
and deeply rooted
yeah.
in
Well,
this
she saw
love.
she didn't get there. She made herself known at that convention in
Yes.
Chicago historically, like, "I'm
Hmm.
gonna be here, and you're gonna
Hmm.
see me, and you're gonna listen to me."
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And like when you're rooted in that ethic of love, which I believe Black liberation struggle, Black prophetic tradition is really rooted in love, and for
Yeah.
me, that love is like, okay, everyone needs to get free, right? But let's draw some attention to the people who are even less free. Right? You know, that when Black people get free, we all gonna get free.
Mhm. Mhm.
That kind of ethic. That yeah,
Right.
we're focusing on our liberation struggle, but this is for everyone, right? At the same time.
Yeah.
Um, but when that ethic is missing, when you're just like pissed off, hurt, angry, whatever, and you think that's the root of your motivation or your drive in particularly political liberation work, then like you're just recreating these same old, I think, carceral logics, which themselves are based on domination and anger and hurt as well.
Absolutely. Yeah,
you know
because there's no way also for all these people who are really, really enraged about what's going
Mhm,
on in Gaza and
mhm,
Israel, I wanna
mhm,
just, you know, I understand the
mhm,
outrage. I understand the hurt. It's atrocious. It's horrible.
mhm,
It's unfair,
mhm,
ultimately unjust, right?
mhm,
And
mhm,
so I guess in the feeling of wanting to protect others,
mhm.
they attack everyone, right, for not
Right,
caring enough
exactly.
and that there's so much importance in what they're
Mhm.
saying though,
Yeah,
right? And I
yeah,
think that's really key is like I thank them. They are
yeah,
waking us up. Like let's
yeah,
not pretend,
yeah,
you know, that
yeah,
things aren't happening that
yeah,
are.
yeah,
But it's how we're doing
yeah.
our activism and how we're doing our work now. Things have changed. It's another level.
Right,
You
right.
can't beat someone into liberation. They have
Yeah.
to choose it.
Absolutely. Absolutely, right? And there has to be tension and struggle, absolutely. There's, and that's a tension that I'm so acclimated to as well. Like I live in that tension, right? Because this is about survival. This is life and death. And there's nothing more intense than survival. right? And it's nothing more intense beyond that than communities of people experiencing genocide in
Right.
real time.
Right.
And the, I mean, the intense despair, right? The intense, like, hopelessness that you experience, which is hard to be with. So, therefore, the anger and the rage sweeps in and takes us out of that intense discomfort and makes us feel really powerful, you know? So, we're riding this wave of like outrage and intensity. And we, anger is something that we have to train really hard to hold. And since most people aren't training hard to hold anger, then you have to direct that energy somewhere.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it has to go somewhere. So the first person who steps out of line is who's going to get this energy, who's going, as we would say, who's going to get this heat.
Right. Oh,
Right?
yeah, and they're administering it all over the internet,
Yeah,
well, everybody is. It's just, like,
yeah,
kind of the
uh,
inability to hold anything
yeah,
seems like it just leaks out all over social
yeah,
media. I mean,
yeah,
it's choppy waters out there for
yeah,
anyone who is, expressing an opinion about political candidates, let's say
yeah,
that,
yeah,
or
yeah,
people they support, or
yeah,
policies, or even that feel patriotic,
yeah.
or
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm,
so it's yeah, and I just wonder what the role is of spiritual leaders. And
yeah,
I feel like, we had even Nelson
mm-hmm,
Mandela,
mm-hmm,
right, became a spiritual leader of he might not have started out that way, but he
mm,
became that.
yeah,
He became an icon of forgiveness and
yeah,
faith and perseverance later in his life, the second part of his life, and
yeah,
when he became, the president of South Africa. But
yeah.
but I like what you're saying, and I think for a lot of spiritual teachers, there's a hold back of jumping in the fray. I see
Mm,
this a lot in,
mhm,
like, whoa, everyone's
yeah,
posting their loving kindness prayers and that's it, right? They're like, oh, if I do this, if I step in and say, hey, everybody, there's insanity and here's politically how we need to get out of it,
mhm.
like do XYZ. I mean, you could get canceled, in this climate
Well,
or
cancel doesn't exist.
yeah, yeah. I mean, not really, but the
No,
it'll be an attempt on,
right, it'll be an
trying
attempt,
to.
right,
It'll be a cancellation
yeah.
attempt, right?
Well, here's the thing, I think we've talked about this before, I always talk about this anyway with folks, it's that, like, because you're a spiritual teacher doesn't mean you're an activist or an organizer, and then to consider as well that, like, a lot of people come into spiritual practice and teaching not from a political place. I did,
Right.
which is, I don't wanna say rare, but, I don't think it's, like, extremely normal, but, like,
Yes.
I went through the process and I was like, "Oh, there's gotta be something else because, like, I'm not gonna survive this kinda struggle," you know? And so when I came into Dharma, I brought, like, my politics, right? And I brought
Mhm.
my beliefs, and I learned how to incorporate that. Because again, as I said earlier, like, I just never felt like there was a separation between activism and dharma. You know.
Right. And that brings up something for me too is when communities, and I shared with you, I don't know if I fully shared with you, I
Mhm.
was recently at a very big gathering.
Uh-huh.
And the organizers of the gathering were debating about should we even talk about the political
Mhm.
climate right now? And they
Mhm.
were all like, no, not really.
Mhm.
Let's not talk about that. And then I started to think like, are we are we that scared about it that
Mhm.
we don't even talk about like you don't even have to talk about the candidate. You could talk about humanity
Yeah.
and policy. Dr. King
Mhm.
never endorsed
Mhm.
candidates. When I was
Mhm.
reading his biography, he
Mhm.
refused to
Mhm.
endorse candidates, but he fought for the
Mhm.
policies that uplifted the lives of the
Yeah.
most oppressed people in
Right.
this country,
Right.
right? He fought for the
Mhm.
vision, the new vision of how to restore rights. So
Yes.
maybe we're too much focused on candidates and not on
Mm.
what is the vision that we're holding.
Yeah. Yeah.
that, would liberate us from this? What are we
I think
asking for, you know?
right. And to go back to the first point that you were just making around like what's the fear for spiritual leaders, spiritual teachers to go into this? I just think that it goes back to people not having a language, for justice, for politics. Again, I think a lot of folks coming into these roles of spiritual teachers never had to deal with it, which is another way of saying that, like, a lot of white folks have never had to deal,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
with, inequity, and I would say particularly white supremacy, right? And like a lot of them are maybe have never really attempted to do this work, around unpacking their indoctrination, right, into white supremacy, right? And so people don't feel so inclined to start doing that in front of a whole bunch of people.
Right, and on camera, so to speak, or online.
Or even just in front of like students, like, because there's also this intense need to maintain expertise. So if I show you me struggling to wrap my mind around this kind of integration of spirituality and politics, then you're going to lose some faith, maybe some hope in me, right?
Mm,
Um,
interesting.
I
Mhm.
Maybe that's part of the risk, but I also think that like the energy is so intense that people are like, teachers are like, oh my God, there's no way that I could step into this. It's like stepping to a hurricane, you know.
Yes.
Um, and on my end, there's something that I thrive off of here, because I can meet that energy,
Yes, you
as
can.
I
Yes,
have
absolutely.
been, but it's not a performance. Like this is I've done this really intense, like, critical work for decades now. Of course, some people may not think it's critical or intense, but like I've put a lot of time and effort and work into getting
Yeah.
clear about how I feel, how I relate to the collective, what my role is, all of that. Identity, suffering, trauma, all of that. Like I've done a lot of work to do that. So I'm clear, right? And I lean more on the side of like, the Black Power movement, like
Mhm.
I lean on that kind of revolutionary space because my deep belief is that, yeah, we all deserve to be free, and whatever gets in the way of that freedom needs to be abolished, disrupted, you know?
Absolutely.
But at the same
Mhm.
time, holding a balance here, saying that, like, we just can't, like, overthrow everything all at once. At the same time,
Exactly, and
there
that's
has to be an
yeah.
alternative, like,
There's not have to have another system. You can't just
yes,
collapse one without a new one,
exactly, because
and be
that's
in
chaos.
chaos.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and for me, people say, "Oh, isn't that, anarchy?" And that's not actually my reading and practice of anarchy is actually much more about how do we create ways of being or systems, if we want to use the word systems, that actually help people to be in their deepest authenticity, right? Their deepest expression of who they are. And at the same time, like being really clear about how that may create harm for others.
Mhm.
Like that's my caveat here. Let's be authentic, but also let's be sensitive, right, to how we create
Yeah.
harm for others. But then we get out of control with that when we say, well, someone being queer and gay or trans, right, is like creating harm for me, you know?
Yeah, and then the people who are too sensitive,
Yeah,
they become violent in their own way,
yeah,
right? It's kind of like the attack on the woke community being
yeah,
kind of gone to
mhm,
some degree of everyone
yeah,
suffering. You harmed me and we're just having a normal
yeah.
conversation,
I'm
and then you're like, "Oh,
uncomfortable. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, there's this like it's like there's so many extremes right now, right?
Well,
Like,
it's extremism too, because like many of us have not grown up having the resources or the support to do real emotional labor
right.
for ourselves, for others around us. Like we don't have that those capacities, and so for a lot of us, including myself, we had to learn how to do this work as when we got older. Like, I found myself in my 20s not even knowing how to deal with anger.
Well, that's really young though, Rod. I mean,
And then, I guess.
we're I mean, most people are getting this. I mean, in some ways, our society is very young,
Yeah,
right? And
right,
it's sort of like with
right.
emotional intelligence. I mean,
Yeah,
people are just getting this stuff in their 70s and their
yeah,
80s, understanding
mhm,
what I'm feeling and how, what's going on in my mind and
yeah,
how that affects my body and my thinking, right?
yeah,
And some we are, I mean, look what's going on out there for half the country. I mean,
yeah,
it's definitely not wisdom,
yeah,
operating.
mhm,
It's a lot of okay. So let's think about the role of the spiritual abolitionist,
okay,
right? So we're carving out
mhm,
this, because actually, other
mhm,
than people like Dr. King and
mhm,
Mandela, and also when I think about Harriet Tubman and I
mhm,
think about Sojourner, I
mhm,
think about people deeply rooted in their spiritual path of
yeah,
being fierce,
yeah,
out
um,
there
yeah,
just like,
yeah,
oh no, we're, Harriet, I'm gonna fight in the war. I'm not even gonna be an activist. I'm gonna be a war general and launch
mhm,
my own raids.
right,
We have what, these
no,
are our ancestors. So I don't see that merger very much. Maybe in the Buddhist world, I was
mhm,
so as I grew up, in my 20s, so
mhm,
inspired by Thich Nhat Hanh, right? Kicked out of Vietnam for protesting the Vietnam War, right? He was, you know, Dalai Lama can't go
yeah,
back home.
yeah,
Refugees,
yeah,
exiled, right? For
mhm,
what they were labeled as politically
mhm,
subversive, right?
mhm,
Politically when they were just really just trying to talk about the government, human rights, and the brutality that was happening.
yeah,
But they go on to lead these huge movements. I mean, wow, I don't know any
yeah,
two other Buddhist teachers from Asia that have had the kind of reach that they have and will continue. They've,
mhm,
Thich Nhat Hanh has passed over now, his
mhm,
ancestor, but Dalai Lama's getting older,
mhm,
it won't be long
mhm,
now.
right,
Um, and then like who are these new folks as that are really spiritual abolitionists
mhm,
and people have been asking me what does that really mean,
yeah.
right?
Tell them to read our books. They can figure it out.
Yeah, and I feel like real time I'm learning because
Yeah,
every generation and every moment calls
yeah,
for some kind of reaction
yeah,
of a certain skill set. Like to be
mhm,
leaders in your spiritual community is one
mhm,
thing. To be a spiritual leader and an abolitionist, we know that's different, right? Because there's
right.
a lot of teachers kind of sitting in their yoga centers. They have all kinds of followings and they're reading Rumi poems and chanting, not a word of what's going on. And
Yeah,
that's what people say. They go, I came
mhm.
here to get away from it.
Oh,
That was
right,
some of the argument that we
I
were having at this
know,
last gathering. We
I
just
know.
want to chant. No,
That's
I'm escaping from that,
that's privilege, though, and that's violence. Like,
Mm.
you can say, "I don't wanna deal with this," because you don't have to deal with this because you are at the top of some structure, some hierarchy where you're
The
getting
cast.
everything that you
Yeah.
need, and then when people in that position look around, they're like, "Why are these people struggling? Like, why are they so angry?" Like, they don't get it because, like, that privilege disrupts the empathy, from scarcity or oppression or domination. And so when someone rolls into a spiritual space and say, you know what, I need to bypass all of this. I need, I don't want to come into this space and think about this. That's just a further act of violence, which, spiritual bypassing, right? And so when
Mhm.
people come to me, it's like, you're trying to run away from the world, but I am the world, honey. you know, like we are like, there's no, like, you're in
There's
the
no inner and
world,
outer, right?
like you're
We're
in
always trying
it.
to suppress something here, get away. Well,
Yeah,
everybody wants to get to the 5D and no one
yeah,
wants to be here in the
exactly.
mess,
Yeah,
that's being created here. I mean,
yeah.
this is like it's hard.
And it's like when you have spiritual teachers who are like promoting this kind of bypassing, instead of saying, no, actually, the liberation is actually it comes from leaning into, moving into what feels difficult.
That feels
Right.
not integrated at all in a lot of communities.
Oh, it's
Let's
not.
lean into it. They think that it's they use it, the illusion, it's the dream,
Mhm.
and that we sort of, but it's like, we're not dreaming, we're here. We are
Yeah,
dreaming, but we're
yeah,
also not,
yeah,
you fall down your stairs, you're going to get a broken arm and
yeah,
that's going to be real for you.
yeah. Yep,
So,
yep,
in a dream, it's not,
yeah,
you can fall down, so let's there's a kind of not
mhm,
groundedness in,
mhm,
and I wonder,
mhm,
yeah, and I wonder how much harm that does to disassociate us from
mhm.
really feeling the suffering that leads to action.
Yeah,
Like if you don't feel the suffering,
yeah,
you got to understand the first noble truth before you
mhm.
get to the second one,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
And the noble truths are this truth about suffering, the
Mhm,
causes of suffering, the end of
mhm,
suffering, and then the path.
mhm.
Um, but if you don't recognize the first one, it seems like we're all stuck on, like, half of us are feeling it and the
Yeah,
other half,
yeah,
or I don't know. These are just this spiritual ramblings from me trying to unpack this
yeah.
in deeper levels.
But it's good, like, it's absolutely what we should be doing. Um, but yeah, I think the more you're bypassing suffering, the more rigid and limited your experience becomes, right? There's you become so afraid to be in the world. You become so limited and rigid because you don't have the practice, the capacity, the emotional intelligence to actually hold whatever arises. So
Mm,
you're always kind of like plotting your trajectory through the world based upon what you have the capacity to deal with or not, or what you
mm,
want to deal with or not want to deal with. And I think in real, authentic, real liberatory Dharma practice, we're saying, you know what, there are no boundaries. Everything that arises is for me to be in relationship with, to hold space for, to metabolize. Like I want to go to where the suffering is because the suffering limits me if I don't understand how to be in relationship with it. Right? I'll never figure out who I am if I don't have a practice to hold the suffering, right? And to
right.
allow myself to feel, to experience the complexity of human experience, which is the complexity of our minds, the complexity of our bodies, the complexity of what it means to live with and amongst so many expressions of energies and consciousness and so forth, right? I want to be open to that. Spirituality isn't like this hideout for me. And this is why I chose Dharma, Buddhism, as a path to
Mm.
invest in, because the first noble truth was like, okay, there's suffering. I was like, great. Like that, I just found that to be so liberating that the first teaching you get is that like you're definitely suffering. Like you're not
You're
like,
caught. Yeah. If you have
you
a
know,
mind, you're suffering. I mean, just
and
look
you're not being
around. Hmm.
punished. It's just suffering is what every being in this experience goes through until we wake up and remember the nature of all this phenomena. And I was like, great, great, sign me up. It wasn't like gaslighting me. It was like saying, no, like you're struggling,
Mm. Yeah,
right?
like the pain you're feeling is real, and others
Yeah,
have dealt with this, talked about it,
yeah,
and transmuted it,
yeah,
right? To ultimate liberation.
yeah,
But you gotta,
yeah.
and we always talk about the willingness to feel it first. We always have to
Mhm.
keep reiterating it, that because our culture is so disassociative. And I think our
Yeah.
country, there's all this stuff going on that nobody knows about. Like, how are
Mhm.
these systems happening? How are
Yeah.
these deals made? It's
Mhm.
like all in this hidden part, right? But I feel like
Mhm.
it represents our own heart and mind, like these hidden parts of ourselves that we don't want to deal with, we don't want to feel. So, so often some backroom deal weapons are being sold all over the world in our name. We don't,
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of us that are with this view of the collective. We are the world. I feel like
Mhm.
we are the United States too,
Mhm.
right? If
Yeah.
you even all the complexity of the
Mhm.
liberation and the Constitution and those who don't want the Constitution, right? And
Mhm.
that say they do, right? But they
Yeah.
don't really want it.
Mhm.
Um, and so here we are, in the middle of that. But I feel like the more the more we teach that, but it's hard because there's a
Yeah.
lot of resistance in the spiritual communities.
Mhm.
Um, and I guess I really am talking about the white spiritual
Yeah,
communities.
you
I
are.
really am.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about the black church. I mean,
No.
we
Mhm.
know that that was a place of dealing with your suffering was to go to church and hear
Mhm.
about it, understand it, be
Mhm.
led by
Yeah.
that, right?
And just to point out as you continue that, like, it's not necessarily the case that the Black church is still the center of Black liberation struggle. I think
Right.
it's actually in other places, in other communities, not the Black church right now. Not
Right.
every Black church, not every Black congregation, but I'm saying that, like, our liberation struggle isn't being informed by Black church now, by the Black
Yeah,
church
it's kind of
community.
yeah, and I guess I was thinking historically, but you're
Yeah,
absolutely
historically.
right.
The
Yeah,
civil rights movement,
historically, the
absolutely.
civil rights movement,
Yeah.
even if in Harriet Tubman's time, she
Yeah.
was a part of
Yeah.
the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
was her church, AME.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of anti slavery,
Mhm.
church based not fully though, because
Mhm.
so much of this was secretive and
Yeah.
hidden, so yeah, and I've been. I also want to bring up another topic too around. I mean, in the same theme of the spiritual abolitionism. So I've been studying the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita,
Mhm.
trying to make sense of like
Mhm.
what is my role as a spiritual abolitionist. Just still chewing on it, and it's still,
Mhm.
and writing books and giving
Mhm.
talks. But there's something that's not fully
Mhm.
for me. What is that full merger of these? I think it's being informed because I can talk about it and I can feel into it, but there's still a place that I feel like we're still defining very deeply what it means to be an abolitionist. Okay,
Right.
but a spiritual abolitionist
Right.
rooted in wisdom and deep compassion,
Yeah.
conducting real work.
Yeah.
Um,
And making hard choices, because there's a complexity here that I think people are trying to oversimplify. Like,
mm,
spiritual abolition means that, yeah, there will still be violence, you know?
right. Like it
It's
doesn't mean that that's just the way of the world,
Yeah,
right?
that's just, it's like, yeah, we're trying to get ultimately free, but there's still political, social freedom on the ground. And sometimes it's like I have to choose violence, not because I'm hurting, it's because violence is the language I have to speak in order to get people to understand that I have a right to be here. I have a right to take up space. I have a right to have access to the resources that I need. And some people they will only listen to the violence, right? And I think about the Panthers is like, yeah, Black Panthers, to carry around guns was a message. Like,
Mhm.
it was setting a boundary. It was saying, no, we have a right to be here, and you need to be reminded that we have a right to protect ourselves, right? Even though that felt like an illusion because the government, was, systematically,
Killing them
disrupting
all.
the
Yeah,
movement,
yeah.
through, yeah, murder plots, prison, all that stuff. Um, Black people have never really been free in America, and we're still not, right?
We've just
And
been
it's,
let loose, but not free,
yeah,
right?
you've
We've
been
been
given
let
like a nice wide open pasture to roam in, but
exactly.
that
Well, we're like
pasture
free
is still
range
fenced.
chickens.
It's like everyone loves Atlanta, for instance. Everyone wants to come here because Black people, we have all this influence and money. That's only a large pasture that white people have given us to roam in to create the illusion of agency. you know and we get caught up in the illusion of freedom when in fact there's a boundary, and if we go too far to that boundary we will be reminded that we're
Mhm.
where
Well, we're
we're
gonna
at and
see
who we
this.
are.
The political energies right now, it
Mhm,
is that. Whose
mhm,
boundary, where
mhm.
are the boundaries? I think that
Yeah.
we're coming up on a
Mhm.
time where that's gonna be clearly sort of defined in some way, I feel,
Yeah.
with these, the election and outcomes and presidential, you know, races and all of this stuff. I feel like we're gonna see the truth
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah.
We're already
Yeah.
seeing it.
And I think people more and more are ready to make choices now, Are you really ready to get free on one hand, or are you really ready to die for these boundaries? Right? Are you really
Mhm.
ready to like put your life on the line to either get free or to reinforce these boundaries that keeps the most suppressed contained? Yeah, and that it's extreme, but like that's where we're at, right? And I think freedom will win. Absolutely.
Yeah, of
I
course.
think with
We'll
some
win.
struggle,
It'll
like as
win.
we are used to, it will win. But no, like let's just go back, to the like spiritual abolition, like to be a spiritual abolitionist, leader or what have you. Like the real struggle. Can you talk more about that struggle for you?
Yeah, well, I think, for me, it's being defined.
Hmm.
It's
Right.
not, there's not only, that's why I brought up Thich Nhat Hanh and
Hmm.
Dalai Lama, because I saw them as being great spiritual leaders,
Hmm.
absolutely writing books and sharing and setting forth like the whole dharma and
Hmm.
meditation and mindfulness and practices and
Hmm.
you know on a global
Hmm.
level, I mean, huge
Yeah.
impact on people's mind and
Yeah.
spiritual practices.
Yeah.
And also, they were these activists that also stood
Hmm.
up for the
Hmm.
government for what was, they told their stories.
Hmm.
They said that, they called it out. There's a lot of Buddhist teachers who don't do that at
Right.
all, and come from the
Hmm.
same part of the world, so they
Right.
were
Hmm.
too, and there's others too, but I was reflecting on the Bhagavad Gita because in
Hmm.
the opening chapter, as you know, there's this. The Bhagavad Gita is one of
Hmm.
the oldest poems in the
Yeah.
world, and it's so beautiful. And
Hmm.
it's a conversation.
Hmm.
Krishna and Arjuna, they start
Hmm.
on a battlefield.
Yeah.
And Arjuna's like, oh my God, he sees some of his relatives, right? And he's on this battlefield and Krishna's there. And he's saying, you have to fight, right?
Mhm.
There's all the symbolism and he's like, I don't want to fight, and the whole story of the start of it. And
Mhm.
Krishna's like, you have to do your dharma. You
Mhm.
have to protect. You have to. This is, you have to fight, and it was like symbolic of you have to
Yeah.
stand up,
Yeah.
right? And then
Yeah.
Krishna goes on. For those of you who know the story of the Bhagavad Gita, he's his
Mhm.
charioteer,
Mhm.
Krishna. Krishna has to reveal he's God. So he plays the
Mhm.
role of God, Krishna in the
Mhm.
story. He is God in that story, in that poem. And he gives him the courage. And I was like, wow. So he first, before he fights, he gets deeply rooted in his spirituality. He's like, okay,
Mhm.
because the whole story is like him coaching, like he doesn't want, he's standing there, right? And it's like they're on. And first, Krishna tells him, I want to remind you of who you are, Arjuna, before you fight.
Yeah.
Right. And it was just something I've been reflecting on. I've been studying. I've been talking to a good friend of mine who's from India and who's a Nina Rao.
Mhm.
She's a chance and she's incredible. And we've been talking about the symbolism of that story for this moment in
Mhm.
time,
Mhm.
right? And so Arjuna had to go through this whole journey of remembering who he
Mhm.
is, rooting in his heart, remembering he's a spiritual practitioner, that he's God, all this
Yeah.
stuff before this battle, which comes for him. He didn't want
Mhm.
to, they were coming for him, right? They were
Mhm.
approaching and he was like, oh my God, this is terrible, right? And
Yeah.
all these feelings about it. Um, so I don't know, that just reminded me of spiritual abolitionists, right? We
Mhm.
we come from this place of knowing deeply who we are,
Mhm.
right? We're rooted in this higher wisdom, or maybe not even higher and lower. Maybe that it's
Mhm.
just isness, right? It doesn't like
Mhm.
I have to get higher.
Mhm.
But there's something about the need for these types of folks right now, this wisdom, because I feel like that's the real leadership that's needed, because this collapse of these
Mhm.
systems, patriarchy and
Mhm.
racism and white supremacy,
Mhm.
as they go down in flames, or
Mhm.
we're battling it, for lack of a better word. Here
Yeah.
we are on the battlefield, like remembering who
Mhm.
we are. And Arjuna had to stand in the front line of that battle,
Yeah.
right? They were like, here you go, here's your spot, right? And he's like,
Mhm.
wow, I'm at the front. Okay, I got to lead it, actually.
Mhm.
And so I'm just thinking about all of the teachers and people all over the world who may
Mhm,
listen to our podcast in our communities who are
mhm,
spiritual leaders and are just grappling with the responsibility
mhm.
of how do I lead as an
Yeah,
abolitionist, but deeply rooted in my
mhm.
spiritual practice for this moment in
Yeah,
time, you know?
yeah,
So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm
yeah.
still sorting it out, what
Right.
is needed,
Sure.
you know?
To tell the truth,
Hmm.
regardless of what that makes you look like, right? And part of that truth for a couple, for folks in general, is that I actually don't know how to make sense of this moment. This feels overwhelming for me. Like, I don't have the language for this. I haven't studied this. I haven't done particular kinds of work. Like, I don't feel informed, you know? Um, to start there, right?
So yeah, to start there. But
Mhm.
what would be the kind of work that would help someone? Because not everybody is called to, be Arjuna in the story on the front,
It's on the front.
in the very front. But many
Well
of us are called for something.
well, I think we're all should be at the forefront of our struggles.
Mm,
Like, everyone has to be at a forefront. It may not be like the forefront of a collective movement, like, the folks that we've been mentioning. I think that's where people get confused. They're like, well, there's no way I can be like Dr. King. There's no way I can be brave and visionary like Fannie Lou Hamer, And I also think about Silva Rivera as well
mhm,
as one of our, you know, mothers, of queer liberation movement, who doesn't get lifted up enough, who's been sitting with me, for a couple of weeks. But maybe they didn't choose to be at the forefront, but the conditions propelled them to the forefront of a movement. They just met the moment. You listen to folks who were at Stonewall that night in '69. There's just
mm.
like shit went down, and all
Right. This is
of a
what
sudden,
happened. Yeah.
something happened, and we were just like, "Fuck it," we're going to jail anyway. Let's fight.
Yeah.
Let's act
Yeah.
up, right? Or we think about the AIDS epidemic, and groups like ACT UP. I mean, they went to the forefront, and they were like, you know, were controversial for like the more middle way, more conservative members of the gay, queer and trans communities, right? But they're like, people are dying, and we can't respond to that in a really critical, direct way.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, this is I keep thinking about, I guess, how we have to say yes to the moment.
Mhm.
What is the
Mhm.
moment asking me to do? And I don't think the moment is asking you to do something that's completely out of your capacity to do. I don't think the moment is asking all these teachers to become Dr. King. You
Right,
know,
because that's a yeah, we're not in that moment. It looks
yeah,
like that
it
moment, but
looks
we're
like
in a
that.
different place and time now.
But what is the moment asking you to do? Like,
Mhm.
what is the front lines work you need to be doing right now? Maybe that looks like maybe you need to go read a book. Maybe you need to go have some conversations. Maybe you need to go and listen to
Mhm.
other people on their front lines, or people in the midst of real like survival liberation struggle, right? Maybe it's that, like, you have to stay silent and give up your seat as a teacher for a period in order to go through this period of learning and listening. But among anything, like, I just want people to know that you don't have to just make shit up, or you don't have to willingly bypass and gaslight people. You don't willingly have to revert back to these kind of cliches, that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
end up really hurting people, you know? Like, well, we all should love each other, blah, blah, blah. That's not what people necessarily need to hear. What we need to start with is telling the truth, but in that truth is the empathy.
Yeah,
you
because the truth
know?
is naturally compassionate.
Yeah. Well, the real
The
truth,
real
right?
truth is, right? The
You
real
know?
one. Yeah, 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 exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's
Mhm.
honest, it's clear, it's what is,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And this, people, I can stir up shit real easily on the social medias, like social media isn't that important for me, right? Like I'm really never on except, just for collecting recipes and looking at kitten videos. But I like when I need to say something, I say something the moment pops up and says, okay, Rod, you need to do something. And
Right, you
I'm given
follow
what I
it, yeah.
need. Do I need to organize something? Do I need to show up somewhere? Do I need to like distribute resources or do I need to just hop on social media and just cuss people out? Like it's just like what is the moment? I'm just listening to the moment. If you can trust the moment, because the moment is like this deep integration, I think, of all the beings who love you, who want you to be free, all the
Mm,
beings you've called. So I trust the moment. When I feel compelled to do something, like I trust it because I know that that's a very direct line, a very open frequency that I've worked really hard to keep open, right? And when I'm called to say, if I need to like organize some type of talk where we're just doing this processing work or a healing circle or some grief work, like I just say, if I'm being called to do this, then I will have everything that I need. I mean, there have been so many times where I've like, hopped on and started organizing something and facilitating, and I've been doing this for years and years, offline, online, both, right? Where I've been like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know what to say. I don't understand these issues. And there are many issues that I'm just like, I'm a little shaky on. But that doesn't
right,
stop me because I tell the truth and say, you know what, I'm in process
right.
around this. Like I am still learning. And I've been very fortunate to have people hold me accountable often,
Mhm.
but I'm also, at this point where it's like there's enough confidence for me to be like, okay, I hear what you're calling out, but let's get deeper into it because I don't think it's all me here. You
Right,
know, that's yeah,
yeah, exactly. Mhm.
that's not a gaslighting. That's just like opening up conversation and
Yeah,
space, because I think as activists, we can all we have sometimes we can have this tendency. I'll just speak for me. I can have this tendency of saying, I'm right, right? I'm right and you're wrong, right? But I am trying to enter into this space where I'm like, okay, but there's always learning to happen. Like I am like many of us in many ways, I still function out of identity locations, that hold a lot of privilege, you know? And that becomes something that I'm not always aware of. And so when people point that out to me, I'm like, okay, yeah, I am doing something that feels ableist. I'm doing something or saying something that feels ableist or transphobic, and I work really hard on that. And at the same time, it's like I want to have the space, the confidence, and the grace from others to say, but I want to raise an issue or a wondering or a curiosity. Is this really about me, or is there something that you're also not taking responsibility for in your
yeah,
practice as you're calling me out? Right. And I don't want to do that in a way that's gaslighting, but I need, what am I trying to say? I think it's just very important that we get a little more fluid, that we can be both perpetrators and victims at the same time,
right, yeah, absolutely.
you
I
know?
think, yeah, that's where the practices really are important.
Hmm.
The more we're disconnected from the present moment, our bodies, what's happening in our own emotional body, yeah,
Hmm.
it's easy to get farther away from
Hmm.
owning our
Yeah.
part in every situation that,
Yeah.
we find ourselves in that might be difficult with another human being.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
everything, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I've
Well,
had people come to me
mhm.
saying that like people go hard on me in terms of like calling out because they know I will listen
Right.
and try to
Yeah.
change. I'm like, but it's still going hard, that's the it's just like, I know you're doing this because you know that I'm not gonna try to bypass it or try to get over it in some way, but it's still hard.
Oh, yeah, but you're good
Yeah.
at that. You're right. You'll sit with it and
Yeah.
you'll chew on it and you'll see into all the angles and then
Yeah.
you'll extract what is real from it,
Yeah.
and the rest you'll just leave behind or share it back as a
Yeah.
reflection on
And that's
yeah.
also the burden here, as someone who's engaged like this, like, I get a lot of pressure to say certain things, to do certain things, to
Absolutely. That's
promote,
kind
to
of the
endorse.
difficulty of why spiritual teachers don't want to come
Yeah,
into this fray because they
yeah,
don't have and I think, as we start getting ready to wrap up this
mhm,
podcast, I think that what makes sense for me is for us to do a series on this, like the
mhm,
role, the role, because I do see that we're like Arjuna on the
yeah,
battlefield and with God, and there's a lot of things that need to be tended to,
mhm,
and how we
yeah,
do this, and we don't have this new language,
yeah,
you
and we're
know.
we're creating and
Yeah,
we're
it's evolving
returning,
right now.
yeah,
Mhm.
returning back to the work of the past, the language that's been left, and then it's innovating in the moment, it's growing, it's shaping, but it's really depending on our own emotional intelligence and maturity here, you know?
Right.
Like, if you're not
Absolutely.
doing that work, then how are you really contributing to real liberation?
Well, then it becomes that mixed bag, right?
Yeah.
You're creating harm as you go out in the world to end it. You're stepping on everything, and and
That's the carceral line, then we talk
yeah,
about the carceral state and spiritual abolition, which I'm, to my knowledge, the only one doing that. The carceral state as like this psycho-spiritual kind of dilemma, and violence. But I've gotten some feedback about that as well. They're like, "Why are you trying to co-opt the language of the carceral state in the political realm?" And I'm like, "Why are you trying to protect the carceral state?"
it
You
gets
know?
deeper and deeper.
Like, why
Yeah,
are
I
you,
mean,
like,
this is
going
the
to bat
thing.
for
I
the
mean,
carceral
yeah,
state?
this is also what I think we're as teachers of the, Spirit Underground, our Liberation Project, which we're going to be talking so much about everyone, our
Yeah.
land project on future podcasts on what we're
Mhm.
doing there and sharing all the stories and all of that with you. But yeah, I mean, this is about more than just other people waking up and
Yeah.
changing things. We're part of it. We're part of
Yeah.
the madness. We're part of the secret bombs being dropped over. This somehow
Yeah.
inner and outer. We're part of all. That's why we can't attack. It's so
Yeah.
funny, attacking one candidate or one person or one elected official
Yeah.
and being like, you're the root of all this stuff has been going on. These
Right.
are battles that
Yeah.
go back to Arjuna and Krishna. These are
Yeah.
ancient.
Yeah.
Right, there's not like we're waking up to it, and I like this idea of new language and new ways, and you know what I realized talking to you, Rod, too, is like, oh, we're doing it. We are doing it. I'm looking for
Yeah.
something else in the language to
Yeah.
provide me
This is
an
it.
example. I was like, wait, you're right. We are already writing about this. We're already doing it, and I think there's just other levels that
Yeah.
maybe we're called upon.
Yeah.
I'm feeling that, feeling that the story in the Bhagavad Gita of like,
Yeah.
okay, now we're standing there on the brink of this battle,
Yeah.
these battles for liberty and freedom and all the stuff, right? All the
Yeah.
stuff, inner liberation, outer liberation, and then yeah, it's like, and then we have to remember we're God,
Yeah.
you know?
But not to take that too
But not to
seriously
take that
and
as
start
you're not that either, right?
right. Yeah. But how all this is driven by contradictions. You are and you're not, or you is and you ain't, you
Well, that's
know?
the role of the spiritual
Yeah.
abolitionist, because if you're just an
Yeah.
abolitionist without that, what made Harriet Tubman
Yeah.
effective is she
Yeah.
saw her true nature.
Yeah.
She did
Exactly.
that liberation work
Yeah.
knowing who she was,
Exactly.
and it made her fearless and
Yeah.
bold and incredibly
Yeah.
prophetic and so and we don't have to emulate Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is Harriet Tubman. That's that, but it's just a conversation that I invite all our listeners is to like, this isn't a one and done conversation.
Mhm.
Like, got it. I'm now a spiritual abolitionist. This is an evolution, right? Of us
Mhm.
being present and responding
Yeah.
collectively. Um, but I think this is like I see this as a series, Rod. I see this as
For
a
sure.
like an evolution
Yeah.
of like meeting the moments together collectively and then sharing insights and then
Mhm.
maybe more about how we're responding moment to moment. For
Yeah.
me right now, I feel like I'm Arjuna. I'm standing there and just like going through the process of
Mhm. Mhm.
alignment.
Right. Right. And also knowing that, like, there's urgency.
Exactly, and I'm moving as fast as I
Yeah.
can, building things behind the scenes to
Yeah.
create structures that
But
can
that's yeah.
hold
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
Mhm,
But that's what we're doing, and this is why for me, I'm not just sitting here talking a good game. Neither are you. We're not sitting here talking a good game about abolition, spiritual abolition. You know, we're doing more than that. We're creating, we're building the alternative structures. Yes, and they have to
mhm,
exist within the existing structures of a government and tax brackets and, and codes and all of that. Yeah, that's happening too. But we're being subversive by saying, we're going to center Black liberation in the
yeah,
work, right? And we're going to get
absolutely.
real subversive in that, as liberation work has always been subversive, you
I love
know?
that word, subversive.
Yeah, I love it. I love saying it too,
You
subversive,
do, I can see your face, you can't well, people will see the video, some won't,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
yeah.
the subversiveness of all of this. But like, and as we wrap up, just want to encourage our colleagues in
Hmm.
the spiritual wellness, self-help world,
The billion-dollar wellness industry now,
that
yeah.
I seemingly don't get, any of that money. But like I just, you have to start somewhere. That's my advice and my encouragement. Start somewhere.
Mhm.
There's a lot of struggles, not just in Gaza, but in the Sudan and Haiti. Um, I, I mean, the Congo. I
Yeah,
mean, this is
yeah.
just like it's
This is just it's on fire.
it's
Everything
on
seems on
fire
fire.
here in
Mhm.
Atlanta on this land with Cop City, the militarization of the police. Like a lot of us are in our local communities, really facing real struggle, as
Yeah,
well as trying to be connected and in solidarity with people all around the world who are experiencing struggle. And, when you start to consider that, it may feel overwhelming, but you start just by educating, like what's going on, what's happening locally, what's happening globally, and how do I start tuning in by first being informed, right? And then secondly, figuring out what my work is,
yeah,
and a lot of our work is to make sure that our students, our communities are seeing us in process around this because I think a lot of students need an example of what this integration looks like in real time. And they need to see you
yes,
being uncomfortable and confused, but they need to see you trying. And yes, you will get dragged through the mud.
yeah,
Yes, you will be attacked, but that's it. Like you have to hold that. Like every liberation, struggle, leader has had to endure attacking, and violence, right?
yeah,
And why are we going to be more special and different? you know?
yeah. Well, people need. You're right. They're afraid to get canceled. They're afraid to
Yeah.
lose their jobs. They're afraid to lose their students. They're
Yeah.
afraid to lose their benefits.
And
They
then you
get
don't
they
know.
get
Yeah.
benefits from these spiritual communities. I mean, this is a billion-dollar. These are
Oh, absolutely.
billions
I
of
get it.
dollar,
I get
industries
it.
and wellness and health and yoga and
Yeah.
all of it.
Then you're not ready to get free then.
No,
And
well,
people need to tell the truth, right? It's like you need to say, you know what, I'm not interested in freedom. I'm interested in being comfortable and having what I need. Fine, that's a different thing that you did invest in. So you just tell yourself the
yeah.
truth.
Or they're interested in individual liberation, or
Yeah.
they wanna go the feel good track.
Yeah.
No, no, let's chant our way through. We can
Yeah.
still pray for the people over there, but let's stay here. And I get it, on one level, wouldn't that be so nice, when and we're all called, but I think this is why we need to do a lot more real teaching on this topic
Mhm.
of what does this mean, and kind of continually, yeah, there's something about how to meet that moment on the battlefield. And pretty soon it's going to be so much knocking on your door. You can't bypass it. It's going to
Yeah.
get so loud.
Yeah.
It is
Mhm.
loud. It's getting louder and louder
Mhm.
and loud. It's escalating and escalating that for all those who want to stay in the bubble, they're going to have to fight to stay in that.
Yeah.
There's going to have to be a real shutting down. And I think that the energy is going in it. It's awakening. It's not going to sleep
Yeah.
right now.
Yep. Mm-mm.
It's
So
not
you
the
might as
time for
well.
sleeping, guys. It's the time to really look around and feel and be in our bodies and be in our hearts and respond, and not see it as not spiritual practice.
Mhm.
Like, see it
Mhm.
as deeply connected to your chanting and
Mhm.
your mantras and your meditation and your yoga and your, you know, vegan dinners and your wellness routine that is
And
like
your
collective.
Teslas.
Yeah, when you're driving your Teslas, and and that goes for all of us.
Yeah.
There's a Yeah. Well, I always love these conversations with you, Lama Rod.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I love this. I hope this has been helpful for all the listeners. You may not agree with something, or you may absolutely agree, or whatever. But in any case, like, we're in process. And this is
Yes.
what a process looks like.
Yes.
Right.
This is what a process looks like. And I think
Mhm.
it's a good one. And for us to be thoughtful, it's not
Mhm.
about, yeah. And we look at history, and we look at the present moment, and we look at our ancestors, and we look at you know, yeah, we look around, and it's a radical time of liberation. It feels like these portals are open for those who are willing to open their eyes,
Mhm.
and everybody's Arjuna and
Yeah.
having a dialogue with God.
Mhm.
So it's just us really being aware of that and opening to that and
Mhm.
seeing in all the levels of that. But yeah, thank you everybody. So please join us for our next episode. And
Yeah.
with that, we give thanks. Blessings to the ancestors.
All
Catch you on
right.
the next episode.
All right. Bye.